Welcome. You've reached a place where history unfolds slowly, one quiet story at a time. So settle into a comfortable position, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let the distractions of today fade into the background. There's nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do except listen. Together, we'll wander through forgotten civilizations, remarkable journeys, and the everyday lives of people who came long before us. Take a slow, comfortable breath, relax, and let the past gently carry you toward sleep. Before we begin, if you'd like more of these quiet journeys through history to fall asleep to, you're welcome to subscribe. New stories arrive regularly, each one as slow and unhurried as this one, so that you always have something gentle waiting for you at the end of the day. Tonight, our journey begins in a wide, sunlit river valley, thousands of years ago, long before most of the history we usually speak of had even begun. We are traveling to the banks of the Indus River, in the region that today spans parts of Pakistan and northwest India, to a world that flourished quietly for well over 1,000 years, and then, just as quietly, faded from memory. There is something calming about a river. The way it moves without hurry, carrying silt and stories along with it, shaping the land patiently, year after year, flood after flood. It was exactly this kind of patience that gave rise to one of the world's earliest urban civilizations, a culture that modern historians call the Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes known as the Harappan Civilization, named after one of its largest cities. Picture the landscape as it may have looked around 5,000 years ago. Wide floodplains stretch out beneath an open sky. The Indus River, fed by melting snow from distant mountains, moves steadily southward, spreading its waters across fields of wheat and barley. Smaller villages dot the riverbanks, their mud brick walls warmed by the sun, their inhabitants moving through daily routines that would feel, in their basic rhythms, not so different from our own. Waking with the light, tending to animals, preparing food, resting when the heat of the day grew too strong. Over centuries, some of these villages grew larger. Farmers began producing more grain than they needed for themselves, which allowed some people to specialize in other kinds of work. Potters shaped clay into storage jars. Metalworkers learned to work with copper and eventually bronze. Traders began carrying goods along the river and out toward the sea. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, villages became towns, and towns became cities. By around 2600 BCE, a number of these cities had grown remarkably large and remarkably organized. At a time when many other parts of the world were still living in smaller, less structured settlements. This period, often called the mature Harappan phase, is when the Indus Valley Civilization reached its fullest expression. And it is where much of tonight's journey will unfold. What makes this civilization so quietly remarkable is not conquest or spectacle. There are no towering monuments boasting the names of kings, no grand inscriptions celebrating military victories. Instead, what has survived is something gentler and, in some ways, more intimate. carefully planned streets, sophisticated drainage systems, weights and measures used consistently across enormous distances, homes built with a sense of privacy and order. It is a civilization that seems to have valued balance, function, and cooperation. And studying it can feel less like reading about ancient rulers and more like glimpsing the quiet infrastructure of ordinary life, built with unusual care. The rivers themselves shaped everything about how this civilization came to be. The Indus is the most famous of them, but there were others, including a river system that scholars once called the Sarasvati or Gagarhakra, which may have once flowed as a major waterway before gradually drying up over the centuries. These rivers deposited fertile silt across the plains each year, in a rhythm not unlike the Nile in Egypt or the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. It's worth pausing on that comparison for a moment, because the Indus Valley Civilization arose at roughly the same time as these other great early civilizations. Yet, for a long time, it remained far less known to the wider world. Its cities were larger than most in Mesopotamia and Egypt combined at their peak, and its territory stretched across a vast area. And yet, its name rarely appeared in early history books. That has changed considerably since the 20th century, as archaeologists have slowly uncovered its extraordinary reach. The civilization's territory eventually extended across more than 1 million square kilometers, an area larger than modern-day Pakistan itself, reaching from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north down toward the coast of the Arabian Sea, and from parts of eastern Iran across to the edges of what is now Delhi. Within this territory, archaeologists have identified over 1,000 settlement sites, ranging from small farming villages to sprawling cities that once housed tens of thousands of people. Only a handful of these have been extensively excavated, which means that even now, much of this civilization remains beneath the earth, patiently waiting. Tonight, we'll walk slowly through some of what has been found. We'll visit the wide streets of Mohenjo-daro, one of the best preserved cities from this era, and stand in our imagination beside its famous Great Bath. We'll wander through Harappa, the city that gave its name to the entire civilization, and consider its enormous granaries. We'll look closely at the objects these people left behind: small carved seals bearing animals, and an as yet undeciphered script, delicate beads made from carnelian and shell, children's toys shaped like tiny carts and whistles. We'll consider how these people governed themselves, seemingly without the grand palaces or obvious rulers found elsewhere in the ancient world. And we'll think about what led, eventually, to the slow decline of their cities, a decline that seems to have come not through war or catastrophe, but through gradual environmental change, unfolding over generations. There is no need to remember every detail tonight. This is not a lecture, and there will be no test in the morning. Think of this instead as a long, slow walk through time, one where you're welcome to drift in and out of listening, and eventually drift into sleep itself, while the story continues quietly in the background. If you wake later and find you've missed a portion, that's perfectly fine. The past will still be here, unhurried, waiting for you to return to it another night. Let us begin at the beginning. Then, in the earliest days of settlement along the Indus, long before the great cities rose from the plains, around 7,000 years ago, in a region called Mayagar, near the Balan Pass in what is now Balochistan, Pakistan, small farming communities were already taking root. This is one of the earliest known farming settlements in South Asia, and its people were cultivating wheat and barley and keeping herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. Excavations at Mayagar have revealed mud brick houses, storage pits for grain, and even early evidence of dentistry, with tiny holes drilled into teeth using flint tools. A discovery that quietly reminds us how resourceful and adaptive these early communities already were. Over the following centuries, agricultural knowledge and technology continued to develop across the wider Indus region. People learned to manage the seasonal floods of the rivers, using the fertile silt left behind to grow reliable harvests. Villages grew closer together, connected by trade in raw materials like flint, shell, and semi-precious stones. Slowly, a shared material culture began to emerge across a wide area, with similar styles of pottery, similar tools, and eventually similar approaches to building. By the early Harappan period, roughly between 3300 and 2600 BCE, larger towns had begun to form at sites such as Kot Diji and early Harappa itself. These towns show the first signs of the planning and organization that would later define the civilization at its height. Streets began to follow straighter lines. Houses were built with more consistent techniques. Trade networks expanded further, bringing materials from distant regions, including lapis lazuli from what is now Afghanistan, and shell ornaments from the coast, hundreds of kilometers away. It's worth resting here for a moment, in this quieter, earlier chapter, before the great cities rose. There is a gentleness to imagining a farming village beside the Indus in this early period. Its people going about tasks that would have felt entirely ordinary to them. Tending fields, shaping pots, weaving cloth from cotton. A fiber this region was among the very first in the world to cultivate and use for textiles. Cotton, in fact, is one of the Indus Valley's quiet gifts to the wider world, later spreading to other regions, and eventually becoming one of the most widely used fibers in human history. As the centuries passed, and as farming techniques improved and trade networks deepened, something shifted. Around 2600 BCE, a number of these established towns underwent a remarkable transformation, expanding rapidly into large, carefully planned cities. This transition from scattered farming villages to a network of sophisticated urban centers happened with what appears to have been surprisingly little violence or upheaval. based on the archaeological record so far, there is little evidence of large-scale warfare during this transition. No widespread destruction layers, no significant fortifications built specifically for defense against human enemies. Instead, the evidence suggests a civilization that grew through cooperation, trade, and shared systems of measurement and planning, spreading gradually across the landscape like water finding its level. This is the world we will step into more deeply in the segments ahead. A civilization that built without the need for grand displays of power, that valued cleanliness and order in ways that still feel remarkably modern, and that eventually vanished not through conquest, but through a slow, patient unwinding, much like the rivers that had given it life in the first place. For now, let your breathing settle into its own natural rhythm. There is nothing more you need to take in tonight beyond this. A river, a floodplain, and the quiet, steady growth of villages into cities, unfolding gradually over centuries, the way sleep itself often unfolds, gradually, gently, and in its own good time. In our next segment, we'll arrive at the city of Mohenjo-daro and walk slowly through its wide streets, its quiet courtyards, and the great stone-lined bath that still sits, empty and peaceful, at its center. Rest now if you're ready, and if not, we'll continue on together. We continue now, drifting gently from the wide floodplains of the early Indus villages toward one of the civilization's greatest cities, Mohenjo-daro. The name Mohenjo-daro is often translated as Mound of the Dead, though this name was given much later, likely by local people long after the city had been buried beneath centuries of silt and sand. We don't know what its original inhabitants called it. That name, like so much about this civilization, has been lost to time. But what remains of the city itself tells us a great deal, and tonight we'll walk through it slowly, the way an evening stroll might feel through a quiet, well-planned neighborhood. Mohenjo-daro sits along the Indus River in what is now the Sindh province of Pakistan. It was rediscovered in the 1920s when archaeologists began excavating a series of mounds that local farmers had long known about, though no one at the time realized just how significant these mounds would turn out to be. As the layers of earth were carefully removed, something extraordinary emerged. An entire ancient city, remarkably intact, with streets, homes, wells, and public buildings still recognizable after more than 4,000 years. Let's imagine walking into the city as it might have looked at its height, around 2500 BCE. The city was built on a grid pattern, with main streets running roughly north to south and east to west, intersecting at right angles. This kind of planned, gridded layout is something we associate today with modern urban design. And yet here it was, laid out with remarkable consistency, thousands of years before cities like New York or Barcelona would adopt similar principles. The city was divided into two main sections. To the west stood what archaeologists call the citadel, a raised mound containing many of the city's most significant public buildings. To the east lay the lower town, a large residential area where most of the population lived and worked. This division between a raised administrative or ceremonial area and a broader residential area appears in several Indus cities, suggesting a shared approach to urban planning across the civilization. Even across cities separated by hundreds of kilometers. At the heart of the citadel sits the structure Mohenjo-daro, is perhaps best known for the Great Bath. Take a moment to picture it. A large rectangular pool built from finely fitted bricks, its walls sealed with a layer of natural tar to make it watertight, a technique that has allowed the basin to survive largely intact across more than 4,000 years. Steps lead down into the pool from both the north and south ends, wide enough for several people to descend at once. Surrounding the bath is a courtyard bordered by a colonnade, and beyond that, a series of smaller rooms, possibly used for changing or for other purposes we can only guess at now. No one knows for certain what the Great Bath was used for, though most archaeologists believe it held some kind of ceremonial or religious significance, perhaps connected to rituals of purification. Water seems to have held real importance in Indus Valley life, both practically and, it seems, symbolically. This is echoed in the city's plumbing more broadly, and it's worth pausing here because the water systems of Mohenjo-daro are, in their own quiet way, one of the most impressive achievements of the ancient world. Nearly every house in Mohenjo-daro had access to a private well, or was located close enough to a public one to draw water easily. Many homes also had their own bathing areas, with sloped floors designed to drain water outward into channels built into the streets. These channels connected to a citywide system of covered drains, running beneath the main streets, carrying wastewater away from the city efficiently. Some of these drains were tall enough for a person to walk through them, allowing for maintenance and cleaning. Manholes, or something quite similar to them, allowed access at intervals along the drainage lines. This is a level of civic infrastructure that many cities in the world would not achieve again until many centuries later. And it speaks to a society that placed real value on public health, cleanliness, and the well-being of its residents, from the grandest buildings down to the smallest home. As we continue walking through the lower town, we find residential streets lined with houses built from standardized, kiln-fired bricks. Remarkably, these bricks were made in a consistent ratio of 4:2:1, length to width to thickness, a ratio still used in brickmaking today, and one that was apparently standard across the entire Indus Valley, from Mohenjo-daro all the way to cities hundreds of kilometers away. This kind of consistency suggests some form of shared standard, agreed upon and maintained across an enormous territory, without, as far as we can tell, any centralized emperor or king enforcing it through decree. It's one of the quiet mysteries of this civilization, How did such consistency emerge and persist for so long, seemingly without the kind of centralized, hierarchical power structures that shaped other ancient civilizations? The houses themselves were often built around a central courtyard, with rooms arranged along the sides. Windows facing the street were rare, and when they existed, they were usually small and set high in the walls, likely for privacy, and perhaps also to help keep interiors cool during the hot months. Doorways typically opened onto side streets or alleys, rather than directly onto the main roads, another quiet nod to the value placed on privacy and separation between public and private life. Some homes were modest, with just a few small rooms, while others were considerably larger, sometimes built across 2 stories, with staircases leading upward, remnants of which can still be seen in the brickwork today. Yet even the larger homes don't show the kind of dramatic wealth disparity we often associate with other ancient civilizations. There are no grand palaces towering over modest huts here. Instead, we see gradations of comfort and space, but nothing that suggests an extreme concentration of power or wealth in the hands of a single ruling family. This absence of an obvious royal palace or grand temple has puzzled archaeologists for decades. In most ancient civilizations we know of, monumental architecture served to glorify a ruler or a religious institution. In Mohenjo-daro, and across the Indus Valley more broadly, no such structure has been clearly identified. The Great Bath itself, while significant, doesn't carry inscriptions praising any particular ruler or deity, unlike comparable structures in Egypt or Mesopotamia. This has led many researchers to suggest that Indus Valley society may have been organized quite differently from its contemporaries, perhaps governed by councils, guilds, or some other form of collective decision-making, rather than a single, all-powerful monarch. This remains one of the civilization's most intriguing open questions, and it's a comforting kind of mystery to sit with tonight. A great and sophisticated civilization that seems, from what we can tell, to have thrived without needing to broadcast the glory of any single person. Nearby the citadel, archaeologists have also identified a large building, often referred to as the Great Granary, though its exact function remains debated. Some believe it stored surplus grain collected from the surrounding countryside, distributed later to the city's population, perhaps as a form of taxation or communal storage. Others have questioned this interpretation, noting that no clear traces of grain have actually been found within the structure. Whatever its true purpose, the building's scale tells us something about the city's capacity for large-scale planning and construction. Using the same fired brick technology found throughout the rest of Mohenjo-daro. As we walk further through the residential quarters, we begin to notice smaller details that bring the city to life in our imagination. Fragments of pottery, some plain and functional, others painted with geometric patterns or images of animals and plants. Small clay figurines, including toy animals, some with wheels attached, suggesting they may have been pulled along by children, much like toys today. Whistle-shaped objects, dice made from cubes of terracotta, and gaming pieces that hint at leisure time, at moments of play, and rest woven into the daily rhythms of city life, not so different from our own. There's a gentle kind of comfort in imagining that, even 4,500 years ago, in a city built along the banks of the Indus, children played with toy carts, families bathed in courtyards warmed by the sun, and communities came together, perhaps in the waters of the Great Bath, in rituals we can no longer fully understand, but can still, in our own way, imagine. As we prepare to leave Mohenjo-daro, let its wide, orderly streets settle in your mind. The careful brickwork, the quiet drainage channels running beneath the city, the empty Great Bath, still holding its shape after all these centuries. There is no rush to understand everything about this place tonight. Some mysteries, like the purpose of the Great Bath or the nature of Indus governance, may never be fully solved, and that, too, is all right. Some questions can simply be held gently without needing an answer, much like the questions that sometimes drift through our own minds as we settle toward sleep. In our next segment, we'll travel north, along ancient trade routes, to the city that gave this entire civilization its name, Harappa, and its enormous, carefully organized granaries. For now, rest here a while longer among the quiet streets of Mohenjo-daro, if you'd like. We travel now, gently, northward, along old trade routes that once connected the cities of the Indus Valley to one another, arriving at last at Harappa, the city that lent its name to this entire civilization. Harappa sits along the banks of what was once a channel of the Ravi River in the Punjab region of present-day Pakistan. It was here, in the 1820s, that a British explorer named Charles Masson first noted the presence of an ancient mound and the remains of old brick structures, though it would take another century before the true scale and age of the site became clear. By the early 20th century, archaeologists Dea Ramsani and later Sir John Marshall began more systematic excavations. And it was through this work that the wider Indus Valley Civilization was first identified and named, using Harappa as its reference point. Sadly, much of Harappa's ancient brickwork had already been removed by the time serious archaeological study began, taken by railway engineers in the 19th century, who used the fired bricks as ballast for railway lines stretching across the region. It's a quiet kind of loss to sit with, knowing that some of what once stood here now lies beneath railway tracks built many miles away. And yet, even with this disturbance, enough remains at Harappa to tell us a great deal about how this northern city once functioned. Like Mohenjo-daro, Harappa was built with a division between a raised citadel area and a larger lower town, following the same general planning principles found throughout the civilization. Streets were laid out in a grid. Homes were built from standardized fired bricks, and a system of drains and wells provided water and sanitation to much of the population. Echoes of the same civic care we encountered in Mohenjo-daro, carried here across hundreds of kilometers of trade routes and river valleys. What sets Harappa apart in the archaeological record are its granaries and its evidence of organized craft production. Just outside the citadel, archaeologists uncovered a row of large, carefully constructed platforms, believed by many researchers to have supported wooden granary structures above them, similar in concept to the possible granary found at Mohenjo-daro. Though here the evidence for organized grain storage and processing is somewhat clearer. Nearby, rows of small circular brick platforms were discovered, each with a hole at its center, thought to have been used for thrashing or pounding grain, perhaps with wooden pestles, worked by hand, in what may have been a shared, communal space for processing the harvest brought in from surrounding farmland. It's worth pausing to imagine this scene for a moment. Workers gathered around these circular platforms, grain being threshed and processed in a steady, repetitive rhythm. The kind of quiet, communal labor that would have structured daily and seasonal life for a great many people in this city. There's something soothing in picturing this kind of steady, purposeful work carried out together, day after day, season after season. The sound of grain being processed, blending with the murmur of voices and the movement of the nearby river. Harappa was also home to substantial evidence of craft specialization. Archaeologists have found workshops where artisans produced beads from carnelian, a reddish semi-precious stone, as well as from agate, steatite, and shell. The process of making these beads was remarkably intricate. Craftspeople would first shape rough stones using stone tools, then drill tiny holes through them using specialized drills tipped with an extremely hard material, before polishing them to a smooth, glossy finish. Some carnelian beads were further decorated using a technique that involved etching white patterns onto the stone's surface, a method that required precise control of both chemistry and heat. These beads were not just used locally. They have been found in archaeological sites as far away as Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, evidence of trade networks that stretched across enormous distances, carrying Indus craftsmanship to distant royal courts and marketplaces. This connection to Mesopotamia is one of the more fascinating threads running through Indus Valley history. Cuneiform texts from Mesopotamia, dating to around this same period, mention trade with a distant land called Meluha, which many historians believe refers to the Indus Valley region, or at least to territories connected to it. These texts describe Meluha as a source of valuable goods, including carnelian, ivory, exotic woods, and even certain types of birds and animals. Some seals bearing Indus script have also been discovered at Mesopotamian sites, further supporting the idea of active trade. And perhaps even small communities of Indus merchants living, at least temporarily, in distant Mesopotamian cities. Imagine, for a moment, the journey such trade would have required. Goods moving from inland workshops down to coastal ports like Lothal, which we'll visit later in our journey, then loaded onto boats and carried along coastal waters, around the edge of the Arabian Peninsula, and up into the Persian Gulf, toward the cities of Mesopotamia. It's a long, patient journey, one that would have taken weeks or months, dependent on the seasonal patterns of wind and current, carried out by sailors and merchants whose names have long since been forgotten, but whose careful, steady work connected two of the ancient world's great civilizations. Back in Harappa itself, alongside the evidence of bead-making, archaeologists have also found workshops connected to metalworking, including bronze tools and ornaments. The Indus Valley Civilization is, of course, part of what we broadly call the Bronze Age, a period defined by the widespread use of bronze, an alloy made by combining copper with tin, or sometimes arsenic. Bronze offered significant advantages over the softer copper tools that had come before it: greater hardness, a sharper edge, and notably, a beautiful golden sheen when polished. Indus craftspeople used bronze to create a wide variety of items, from simple tools like chisels and knives to more elaborate objects, including finely detailed figurines. One particularly striking bronze figure discovered at Mohenjo-daro rather than Harappa, but worth mentioning here as we consider the broader tradition of Indus metalworking, is a small statue often referred to as the Dancing Girl. Standing just over 10 centimeters tall, this bronze figure depicts a young woman standing with one hand on her hip, wearing a series of bangles along one arm, her posture relaxed and confident. Created using a technique called lost wax casting, in which a wax model is coated in clay, then heated so the wax melts away, leaving a mold to be filled with molten bronze. This figure represents an extraordinary level of technical and artistic skill. Looking at her now, preserved in a museum collection after more than 4,000 years, it's hard not to feel a quiet sense of connection. A young artist, working with careful hands, shaping a small figure meant, perhaps, simply to bring a little beauty into someone's home. Returning to Harappa, we find evidence too of the city's role as a center for craft training and standardization. Similar bead-making techniques, similar bronze alloys, and similar pottery styles have been found not only here, but across many Indus Valley sites, suggesting that knowledge and technique were shared and taught consistently across an enormous geographic area. This wide consistency, much like the standardized bricks and weights we encountered in Mohenjo-daro, speaks again to some underlying system of shared knowledge and cooperation that bound these distant cities together, even without, as far as we know, a single centralized government enforcing these standards by force. As evening settles over our imagined walk through ancient Harappa, let's picture the quiet end of a working day here. Artisans setting down their tools after hours spent shaping beads and casting bronze. Farmers returning from fields along the Ravi River, grain safely stored in the granaries near the citadel. Children, perhaps, playing with small clay toys near the doorways of their homes, much as children did in Mohenjo-daro, hundreds of kilometers to the south. The rhythms of daily life here would have felt steady, structured, and in their own way, deeply peaceful. Work, rest, trade, and craft, repeating gently across the seasons, year after year, for many centuries. In our next segment, we'll continue our journey southward, toward the coast, to the port city of Lothal, and consider how the Indus Valley Civilization connected itself to the wider ancient world through trade by sea. Rest here a while, among the quiet granaries and bead workshops of Harappa, if you're ready to let your thoughts settle further. From the inland granaries of Harappa, we now travel south and east, following old trade routes toward the coast, to a smaller but remarkable city called Lothal. Lothal sits in what is now the Indian state of Gujarat, near the Gulf of Combat, close to where the Sabarmati and Bhagava rivers once met the sea. Though considerably smaller than Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, Lothal holds a special place in the story of the Indus Valley Civilization because of a single, remarkable structure. What many archaeologists believe to be one of the world's earliest dockyards. Picture a wide, rectangular basin lined with fired brick walls, connected by a channel to a nearby river, which in turn led out toward the sea. This structure, roughly 218 meters long and 37 meters wide, has been interpreted by many researchers as a facility for docking and loading boats, allowing vessels to enter with the rise of the tide and remain safely afloat, even as water levels shifted throughout the day. Sluice gates, believed to have controlled the flow of water in and out of the basin, would have helped regulate this process, keeping the dock functional even during periods of low tide. Not every archaeologist agrees on this interpretation. Some have suggested the basin may instead have served as a large reservoir, storing fresh water for the city rather than functioning as a dock. This is one of those gentle uncertainties that archaeology often leaves us with. A structure clearly built with great care and purpose, whose exact function we can reasonably debate, but perhaps never fully confirm. Either way, whether dockyard or reservoir, the structure speaks to a city deeply concerned with managing water, much as we saw in the wells and drains of Mohenjo-daro, adapted here to the particular needs of a coastal, tidal environment. Lothal's location placed it at an important junction between inland trade routes and maritime routes reaching out across the Arabian Sea. Excavations here have revealed warehouses, workshops, and evidence of extensive beadmaking, much like at Harappa, alongside seals and weights consistent with those used throughout the wider Indus Valley trading network. It seems likely that raw materials arriving from inland regions and finished goods produced in workshops like those at Lothal were gathered here before being loaded onto boats and sent onward along the coast and out into the wider maritime world. Imagine, for a moment, a quiet morning at Lothal several thousand years ago. Boats resting gently in the basin, their hulls made from wooden planks, patiently constructed by hand. Workers moving steadily along the dock, carrying woven baskets filled with beads, cotton textiles, and other goods destined for distant ports. The murmur of voices in the local language, the creak of rope, the gentle lapping of tidal water against brick walls that had been carefully fitted together, brick by brick, to hold back the sea. Seafaring in this era would have relied on a deep, practical knowledge of coastal winds, tides, and currents. Knowledge passed down through generations of sailors and traders, likely without any written navigational charts as we would understand them today. Boats of this period were probably relatively simple in construction compared to later vessels, likely reed boats coated in bitumen for smaller coastal trips, and wooden plank-built ships for longer voyages. Though our understanding of Indus Valley shipbuilding remains limited, based mostly on small clay models, seal depictions, and comparisons to shipbuilding traditions known from neighboring regions during the same era. One particularly evocative piece of evidence comes from a small terracotta seal found at Mohenjo-daro, which appears to depict a boat with a central cabin and what may be steering oars at either end. It's a modest little image, easy to overlook, and yet it offers us one of our only direct glimpses into how these ancient sailors might have imagined and depicted their own vessels. A quiet window into the maritime world of the Indus Valley. Lothal's connection to the sea placed it within a much larger network of maritime trade that stretched from the coast of the Indus region, along the shores of what is now Oman and the Persian Gulf, and onward toward Mesopotamia. Archaeological finds along this route help trace these connections. At sites in the Persian Gulf region, such as those associated with the ancient land of Dilmun, believed to correspond to modern-day Bahrain, archaeologists have found Indus-style weights, seals, and pottery. Evidence that this island served as an intermediary trading point between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia, much like a quiet harbor town positioned carefully along a long and patient trade route. This maritime network would have carried a wide variety of goods. From the Indus Valley outward, cotton textiles, carnelian beads, ivory objects, timber, and perhaps foodstuffs like sesame oil or spices, flowing back toward the Indus. Materials such as copper and tin from regions where the Indus Valley lacked easy access to these metals, needed for the bronze that shaped so many of its tools and ornaments, as well as items like wool and possibly silver from Mesopotamia and the wider Persian Gulf region. It's worth noting, gently, that trade during this era did not necessarily require large empires or standing armies to protect it. The evidence we have suggests a network sustained largely through mutual benefit, shared standards of weight and measurement, and long-established trust between distant trading partners, sometimes spanning multiple generations of the same merchant families. This, again, echoes the broader pattern we've encountered throughout our journey so far. A civilization that appears to have thrived not through domination, but through cooperation, careful planning, and quiet consistency, maintained patiently across enormous distances of both land and sea. Beyond its role in trade, Lothal offers us a few other gentle glimpses into daily life along the Indus Valley coast. Archaeologists have found evidence of a small fire altar area, along with a variety of terracotta figurines and toys, not unlike those found at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Burial sites near the city offer further quiet clues about the lives of ordinary residents, showing burial practices generally modest in nature, with simple grave goods such as pottery vessels placed alongside the deceased, though burial customs did vary somewhat across different Indus Valley sites, suggesting some degree of regional or perhaps personal variation in how communities chose to honor their dead. As we prepare to leave Lothal, let the image of that quiet tidal basin settle in your mind. Boats resting gently within brick walls, built with such careful attention to water and tide. Workers moving unhurriedly along the docks. Goods gathered here from across a vast trading network that stretched from inland cities all the way to the distant shores of Mesopotamia. It's a gentle reminder that even in the ancient world, connection across great distances was possible, built not through haste, but through patience, cooperation, and the steady, repeated work of countless individuals whose names we will never know, but whose quiet labor connected the Indus Valley to a much wider world. In our next segment, we'll turn from trade and travel to something a little more intimate. The homes, streets, and everyday routines of ordinary Indus Valley families, gathering together what we know about how people here actually lived, day to day, season to season. Rest here a while longer among the quiet docks of Lothal, if you'd like, before we continue. Let's turn now gently away from trade routes and dockyards and step instead into the quieter, more intimate spaces of everyday Indus Valley life. The homes, streets, and daily routines that shaped the ordinary days of the people who lived within these cities. Across Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and the many smaller towns and villages that made up the Indus Valley Civilization, homes shared certain common features, adapted, of course, to the resources and preferences of each individual family, but following broadly similar principles wherever we look. Most houses were built around a central courtyard, open to the sky, which would have served as the heart of daily household activity. Cooking, grinding grain, weaving cloth, and other everyday tasks likely took place here, in the open air, shaded perhaps by simple awnings during the hottest parts of the day. Rooms were arranged around this courtyard, their walls built from fired or sun-dried mud bricks, depending on a family's resources and the particular conventions of their city. Roofs were most likely flat, constructed from wooden beams topped with packed earth or reeds, a style still common in parts of South Asia today, and one that would have provided an additional outdoor space, a rooftop area where families might have slept during particularly hot nights, catching whatever breeze moved through the city after sunset. Bathing areas appear in a great many homes, usually a small paved room with a slightly sloped floor, designed to direct water toward a drain that connected to the street's larger drainage system. The same careful network of channels we encountered while walking through Mohenjo-daro. It's a small detail, but a telling one. Even modest homes seem to have had access to some form of private bathing space, connected to citywide sanitation infrastructure, a level of everyday comfort and hygiene that wouldn't become common again in many parts of the world until many centuries later. Kitchens, where identifiable, often included hearths built into the courtyard or into a designated room, along with grinding stones used to process grain into flour. Archaeologists have found large numbers of these grinding stones across Indus Valley sites, worn smooth from years, sometimes generations, of steady use, evidence of the quiet, repetitive work involved in preparing daily meals. Wheat and barley formed the foundation of the Indus Valley diet, ground into flour and likely baked into flatbreads, not unlike breads still eaten across the region today. Alongside these staples, people grew and consumed a variety of other foods: lentils, peas, sesame seeds for oil, dates, and a range of fruits and vegetables suited to the local climate. Animal husbandry played an important role too. Cattle appear frequently in Indus Valley art and archaeology, likely valued both for their labor, pulling carts and plows, and for their milk. Sheep and goats provided wool and meat, while evidence suggests that some communities also kept chickens, among the earliest known instances of chicken domestication anywhere in the world. Fish, too, formed part of the diet in cities located near rivers or the coast, caught using nets and hooks, evidence of which has survived in the archaeological record. Clothing during this period was likely woven from cotton, a fiber the Indus Valley people cultivated with particular skill, spinning it into thread and weaving it into cloth using simple looms. Fragments of cotton textile, along with the small terracotta spindle whorls used to spin thread, have been found at multiple Indus sites, offering us quiet, tangible evidence of this craft. We don't know exactly what Indus Valley clothing looked like in its finished form, since textiles rarely survive across thousands of years, but depictions on seals and figurines suggest simple garments, perhaps wrapped or draped rather than tailored and sewn, along with a clear fondness for personal ornamentation. And what wonderful ornamentation it was. Bangles made from shell, bronze, or terracotta, sometimes stacked along the arm in great numbers, much like we saw on the small bronze dancing girl figure from Mohenjo-daro. Necklaces and pendants crafted from carnelian, agate, steatite, and shell, some strung simply, others arranged in elaborate, carefully balanced patterns. Earrings, hair ornaments, and small decorative pins have all been found across Indus sites, suggesting that personal adornment and perhaps a genuine sense of individual style and beauty mattered a great deal to the people who lived here, regardless of their particular social standing. Children's lives, too, come through gently in the archaeological record, in ways that feel warmly familiar even across such a vast expanse of time. Small clay toys shaped like carts, complete with wheels that could actually turn, have been found in considerable numbers, suggesting these were popular, perhaps mass-produced items, made by potters who understood exactly what would bring a child joy. Whistle-shaped toys, shaped like birds, have also been discovered, some still capable of producing a soft sound when blown into, even after thousands of years resting quietly underground. Small clay animals, some designed with movable parts, suggest a playful, inventive approach to toy making, not so different in spirit from toys children play with today. Streets throughout Indus Valley cities followed the same grid pattern we encountered at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, with wider main roads intersected by narrower side lanes leading to individual homes. These streets weren't merely open ground. Excavations reveal careful attention to their construction and maintenance, kept relatively clear of debris, with drainage channels running alongside or beneath them to carry wastewater safely away from where people lived and walked. Streetside doorways generally opened onto these smaller lanes rather than the main thoroughfares, offering households a degree of privacy and quiet, away from the busier flow of city life on the larger roads. Along these streets, small workshops and shops likely operated based on the arrangement of certain buildings and the concentration of craft-related debris found within them. Things like discarded shell fragments from bead-making, bits of copper and bronze from metalworking, or fragments of pottery from a potter's workspace. It's easy to imagine these streets filled with a gentle, steady hum of activity. The tap of a beadmaker's tool, the low murmur of bartering over goods, children's laughter drifting from a nearby courtyard, the rhythmic thud of grain being ground nearby, and above it all, the warm, steady light of the sun moving slowly across a sky that has, in its essentials, changed very little since those days. Public wells, positioned at intervals throughout residential areas, would have served as important daily gathering points, places where residents came to draw water for their households, and quite likely, places where neighbors paused to exchange a few words, share news, or simply enjoy a moment of company during an otherwise busy day. It's a small, human detail, easy to overlook amid discussions of drainage systems and standardized bricks, but perhaps one of the most relatable. People gathering briefly and unhurriedly around a shared water source, much as people have done in communities across the world throughout nearly all of human history. As evening fell across an Indus Valley city, we might imagine families gathering on their rooftops as the heat of the day eased, sharing a simple meal together, perhaps flatbread with lentils, a bit of milk or fruit, the murmur of conversation blending with the quiet sounds of the settling city below. Distant voices, the soft lowing of cattle being brought in for the night, the gentle creak of a cart's wooden wheels somewhere down a side street. Above them, the same stars we see today would have begun to appear, unchanged across the thousands of years that separate their world from ours. There is something deeply calming in recognizing just how familiar so much of this daily life actually feels, even across such an immense distance of time. People waking with the sun, preparing food, caring for children, tending to animals, working steadily at their crafts, gathering water, resting in the cool of evening. The particular details differ, of course, shaped by their tools, their materials, their climate, and their beliefs. But the underlying rhythm, the quiet, patient rhythm of ordinary daily life, feels remarkably close to something we might still recognize in ourselves today. In our next segment, we'll look more closely at the objects the Indus Valley people used to communicate and to organize their trade. The small, carefully carved seals bearing images of animals, and a script that, even now, remains undeciphered. One of history's most patient and enduring mysteries. Rest here a while longer, among these quiet courtyards and rooftop evenings, if you're ready to let sleep settle in a little further. Let's turn our attention now to some of the smallest objects the Indus Valley Civilization left behind. And yet, in many ways, some of the most quietly fascinating. Their carved seals and the mysterious script inscribed upon them. Across Indus Valley sites, archaeologists have recovered several thousand small seals, most carved from soft steatite stone, a material easy to work with simple tools, then often fired to harden it before use. These seals are generally quite small, typically just 2 to 3 centimeters square, easily held between 2 fingers. And yet, each one was crafted with remarkable care and precision. The most common design found on these seals features an animal, carved in profile, standing calmly, often beside a small object placed in front of it, sometimes interpreted as an offering stand or a ritual item, though its true meaning remains uncertain. Above this central image runs a short line of symbols, a script that researchers refer to simply as the Indus script, consisting of small pictographic signs, some resembling simple shapes, others more complex, arranged in careful, deliberate sequences. Let's picture one of these seals a little more closely. Perhaps it shows a humped bull, known as a zebu. Its powerful shoulders and curved horns rendered with quiet, confident linework, despite the seal's tiny size. Or perhaps an elephant, its form simplified but unmistakably recognizable. Ears and trunk carved with careful, economical strokes. Other seals depict tigers, rhinoceroses, water buffalo, and antelope, along with a mysterious composite creature often called the unicorn, a single-horned animal that doesn't correspond precisely to any real species, and whose meaning and symbolism remain, like so much else from this civilization, gently unresolved. These seals were likely pressed into soft clay, leaving a raised impression that could then harden, perhaps used to mark ownership of goods, to seal containers or bundles during trade, or to authenticate agreements between merchants and traders. Archaeologists have found small lumps of clay bearing these seal impressions at various Indus sites, and even, remarkably, at distant Mesopotamian sites, further evidence of the trade connections we explored earlier in our journey, carried quietly across the sea from Lothal and other coastal cities, all the way to distant Mesopotamian ports. The script itself remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of ancient history. Despite many decades of careful study by researchers around the world, the Indus script has never been definitively deciphered. We don't fully know what language or languages it may represent, whether it records an early form of a Dravidian language, an early Indo-Aryan language, or perhaps something else entirely, now lost from the linguistic record. We don't know for certain whether it represents a full written language at all, capable of recording complete sentences and complex ideas, or whether it functioned more as a system of symbols, perhaps representing names, titles, types of goods, or ritual concepts, without necessarily forming complete grammatical sentences in the way we typically think of writing. Part of what makes decipherment so difficult is the brevity of the inscriptions themselves. Most seals contain only a handful of symbols, rarely more than 10, and unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, we have no equivalent to the Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription pairing the Indus script with a language we can already read. That might offer archaeologists a way into translating it with confidence. Researchers have identified somewhere between 400 and a few hundred distinct symbols used across the known inscriptions, though the exact count depends on how variations and combinations of symbols are classified. A debate that continues quietly within academic circles, even now. Various scholars have proposed different approaches to studying the script over the years. Some have used computational analysis, studying the patterns and sequences in which symbols appear, to explore whether the script behaves more like a full language or more like a simpler symbolic system. Others have focused on comparing the frequency and placement of certain symbols to patterns found in known ancient languages, searching for clues that might eventually unlock its meaning. So far, however, no single theory has gained universal acceptance among researchers, and it remains entirely possible that the Indus script may never be fully deciphered, particularly if, as some suspect, no lengthy inscriptions or bilingual texts are ever discovered. There is, in a way, something rather peaceful about this ongoing mystery. Unlike a puzzle we feel pressure to solve quickly, the Indus script has patiently waited nearly a century since its first serious study, and it seems content to wait a good while longer, unhurried, much like the civilization it once served to record. Perhaps someday, a new discovery, a longer inscription, a chance archaeological find, will offer researchers the breakthrough they've long sought. Or perhaps this particular door into the ancient world will simply remain gently closed, its secrets held quietly within tiny carved stones for as long as they continue to exist. Beyond the animal seals, the Indus Valley Civilization also left behind evidence of a shared system of weights and measures, closely connected to their broader systems of trade and record-keeping. Small cubical weights, carved from stone such as chert, have been found in remarkably consistent ratios across the entire civilization, following a system based on doubling and multiples, allowing merchants in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Lothal, and countless smaller towns to weigh goods using a shared, standardized method, regardless of where in the vast Indus territory they happened to be trading. This consistency, again, echoes something we've encountered throughout our journey tonight: an underlying thread of shared standards and cooperative systems, stretching across an enormous territory, apparently maintained without the need for a centralized empire enforcing it by force. It suggests a civilization bound together not by conquest, but by shared practical knowledge, likely passed down through trading families, craft guilds, or perhaps regional administrative centers we have not yet fully identified or understood. Some seals also appear to have held personal or perhaps official significance, possibly indicating names, professions, clan affiliations, or roles within their community. Not unlike name seals or personal signets used in later civilizations across Asia. If this interpretation is correct, then each small seal we examine may represent, in its own quiet way, a single individual, a merchant, a craftsperson, an administrator, someone who once pressed this small stone into soft clay, leaving behind an impression that would outlast them by more than 4,000 years, carrying a small, silent trace of their identity forward into a future they could never have imagined. As we consider these tiny objects tonight, seals no larger than a fingertip, carved with steady, patient hands so long ago, there's something worth sitting with gently. How much of what remains from this civilization exists in miniature? Small seals, small toys, small beads, fragments of a much larger world, reduced now to objects we can hold quietly between two fingers each one a small window into lives lived fully, ordinarily, and peacefully, so very long ago. In our next segment, we'll turn to questions of belief and ritual, exploring what the archaeological evidence can tell us, gently and with appropriate uncertainty, about how the people of the Indus Valley may have understood the sacred and the unseen aspects of their world. Rest here a while, among these small carved stones and their quiet, unsolved script, if you'd like, before we continue our journey. Let's move now, gently, from the material world of trade and craftsmanship into a quieter, more uncertain space, the beliefs, rituals, and spiritual life of the Indus Valley people. This is a part of our journey where we must walk especially carefully and especially slowly, because so much of what we might wish to know here remains genuinely uncertain, filtered to us only through objects, and never through the words or explanations of the people who created them. Unlike ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, where extensive written texts describe religious beliefs, myths, and rituals in considerable detail, the Indus Valley Civilization has left us no readable religious texts at all. The undeciphered script we explored in our last segment offers no direct window into what these people believed about the divine, the afterlife, or the unseen forces they may have felt shaped their world. Instead, we're left to consider a range of physical evidence, quietly suggestive, but never fully conclusive, and to hold our conclusions loosely, with the same patience this entire civilization seems to ask of us. One of the more commonly discussed pieces of evidence comes in the form of small terracotta figurines, found in considerable numbers across many Indus Valley sites. Many of these figurines depict female forms, often adorned with elaborate headdresses, necklaces, and other ornamentation, their bodies rendered in a somewhat simplified, stylized manner. Some researchers have interpreted these figurines as representations of a mother goddess or fertility deity, suggesting they may have played a role in household worship or ritual practice, perhaps placed in small shrines within homes, or used in ceremonies connected to fertility, harvest, or protection. Other researchers urge more caution, noting that we cannot be entirely certain these figures represented divine beings at all. They may instead have served as toys, as decorative objects, or as representations of respected ancestors. And it's worth sitting with this uncertainty rather than rushing past it toward a tidy, satisfying answer. Alongside these female figurines, a smaller number of seals and figurines suggest possible connections to male deities as well. One particularly well-known seal, sometimes referred to by researchers as the Pashupati seal, depicts a seated figure wearing a horned headdress, surrounded by various animals, including what appear to be an elephant, a tiger, a rhinoceros, and a water buffalo, along with 2 deer or goats resting beneath the seated figure's throne-like seat. Some scholars have proposed this figure may represent an early precursor to later deities associated with animals and asceticism in South Asian religious traditions. Though this interpretation remains firmly speculative, drawn more from later religious parallels than from any certain evidence contemporary to the Indus Valley itself. It's a small, careful carving that has generated a great deal of scholarly discussion over the decades, precisely because it offers just enough detail to invite interpretation, while remaining far too limited to offer any definitive answer. We also find evidence, gently scattered across various sites, suggesting a possible reverence for certain animals within Indus Valley belief systems, echoing the frequent, careful depictions of animals we encountered on seals in our previous segment. The humped bull, or zebu, appears repeatedly and prominently, suggesting it may have held particular symbolic or spiritual importance beyond its obvious practical value as a working animal within Indus Valley agriculture. The elusive unicorn figure, appearing more frequently than any other single image across the seal collection, remains especially puzzling, its meaning and symbolism entirely unknown to us today. A single-horned creature whose significance was clearly well understood by the people who carved it so many thousands of times, yet remains gently closed off to us now. Water, too, seems to have held some form of ritual or symbolic importance, a theme that connects back to our visit to the Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro. The careful, consistent presence of bathing areas within homes, alongside the grand, ceremonial scale of the Great Bath itself, suggests that concepts of purity and cleansing, whether purely practical or carrying deeper symbolic meaning, played some meaningful role in Indus Valley daily and ritual life. This connects, in a broad and gentle way, to later religious traditions across South Asia, where ritual bathing and the symbolic importance of water continue to hold significant meaning even today. Though we should be careful not to draw too direct or certain a line between Indus Valley practices and much later religious developments separated from them by well over 1,000 years of historical chain and transformation. Burial practices offer us another gentle window into Indus Valley beliefs about death and what might follow it. At sites including Harappa and a cemetery site known as Farmana, archaeologists have found burials generally oriented in a consistent manner, with bodies laid out with care, typically accompanied by simple grave goods, pottery vessels, ornaments such as shell bangles or beads, and occasionally small personal items. These burials suggest a belief in some form of continuity after death, a sense that the deceased might benefit from these objects in whatever existence followed. Though the exact nature of Indus Valley beliefs about death, the soul, or an afterlife remains, like so much else, beyond our certain knowledge. Interestingly, cremation may also have been practiced in some communities or periods, based on evidence from certain sites, suggesting that burial customs, much like other aspects of Indus Valley life, may have varied by region, by community, or perhaps by an individual family's own particular traditions and preferences, rather than following a single, universally standardized practice, as we saw so clearly with their bricks and weights. Fire, too, appears in the archaeological record in ways that may carry ritual significance. Small structures identified as fire altars have been found at several sites, including Kalibangan, a city we haven't yet visited on our journey, located along the dry bed of the ancient Gagarhakra River system. These fire altars, arranged in careful rows within what may have been dedicated ritual spaces, suggest that fire held some ceremonial importance for at least some communities within the Indus Valley Civilization, a practice that some researchers have connected, cautiously and speculatively, to later fire rituals known from Vedic religious traditions. Though again, this connection remains a matter of scholarly discussion rather than settled certainty. What emerges from all of this, gently pieced together from figurines, seals, burial customs, and architectural remains, is not a clear, complete picture of Indus Valley religion, but rather a series of soft, suggestive impressions, a reverence for certain animals, a possible connection between water and purity, some form of belief in continuity beyond death, and scattered evidence of ritual practices involving fire, all existing, it seems, without the grand temples, towering religious monuments, or explicit written theology found in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. Perhaps this, too, reflects something of the quiet, understated character we've encountered again and again throughout our journey tonight. A civilization that seems to have expressed its beliefs modestly, through small, carefully made objects and consistent daily practices, rather than through grand public displays or elaborate religious monuments meant to be seen and admired from a great distance. There's a gentle kind of comfort in imagining spirituality woven quietly into the fabric of everyday life here. A small figurine resting in the corner of a home, a seal carried close in daily trade, a careful bath taken each morning, a fire tended with quiet attention, rather than religion existing as something separate, grand, and set apart from ordinary living. As we prepare to leave this quieter, more uncertain part of our journey, let yourself rest gently in this ambiguity, rather than reaching for a firm conclusion. Not every question from the ancient world needs to be answered fully. Some can simply be held softly, the way we might hold an old, worn stone whose exact origin we can no longer quite recall, turning it over gently in our hands, appreciating its weight and shape without needing to fully understand its complete story. In our next segment, we'll travel to the edges of the Indus Valley territory, to smaller cities and regional centers, including Dholavira and Kalibangan, considering how this civilization adapted its shared culture to different landscapes across such an enormous territory. Rest here a while longer among these small figurines and quiet fire altars, if you're ready to drift a little further toward sleep. Our journey now carries us toward the edges of the Indus Valley world, to cities built in more challenging landscapes, where local communities adapted the shared culture we've explored tonight to the particular demands of their own environment. We begin at Dholavira, a city built on Qadir Island, within the vast salt marsh region known as the Rann of Kutch, in what is now Gujarat, India. Unlike Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, situated along major, reliable rivers, Dholavira faced a considerably drier, harsher environment, with limited and highly seasonal access to fresh water. And yet, rather than being limited by this challenge, the people of Dholavira responded to it with what may be some of the most sophisticated water conservation engineering found anywhere in the ancient world. The city was built with an intricate system of large stone-cut reservoirs, some quite massive in scale, carved directly into the bedrock and lined carefully with stone to reduce water loss. These reservoirs were positioned to capture and store rainwater during the brief monsoon season, along with water diverted from two seasonal streams that flowed near the city, ensuring a reliable water supply could be carefully managed across the long, dry months that followed. Some estimates suggest that these reservoirs and the surrounding channels may have occupied close to a third of the city's total area, an extraordinary allocation of space and effort, reflecting just how central water management was to daily survival and civic planning in this particular corner of the Indus Valley world. Dholavira's layout also differed somewhat from the two-part citadel and lower town structure we saw at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Here, archaeologists have identified a more elaborate three-part division: a heavily fortified citadel area, a middle town, and a lower town, each separated by substantial stone walls, constructed using a technique combining stone with mud brick, adapted sensibly to the particular building materials available in this drier, rockier landscape, quite different from the fine, uniform fired bricks so dominant at Mohenjo-daro. One especially intriguing find at Dholavira is a large inscription, sometimes called the Dholavira signboard, consisting of 10 large symbols from the Indus script, each symbol crafted from gypsum and originally set, it's believed, into a wooden board that would have been mounted above one of the city's main gateways. At roughly 3 meters in length, this is among the largest known examples of Indus script writing, and its prominent placement suggests it likely conveyed some significant public message, perhaps the name of the city itself, or an important civic or religious declaration, positioned where every resident and visitor passing through the gate would have seen it clearly. Sadly, without a means of translating the script, its exact message remains, like so much of the Indus Valley's inner life, quietly beyond our reach for now. From Dholavira, let's travel northeast to Kalibangan, a city built along the now dry bed of the ancient Gagarhakra River system in what is today the Indian state of Rajasthan. Kalibangan offers us a particularly interesting glimpse into the earlier phases of Indus Valley urban development. Alongside evidence of the fire altars we touched on gently in our previous segment, excavations at Kalibangan have revealed evidence of plowed agricultural fields, preserved beneath later layers of settlement, showing furrow patterns remarkably similar to farming methods still used in parts of the region even today. A quiet, comforting continuity stretching across thousands of years of agricultural tradition along this now vanished river. The city itself followed the familiar Indus Valley pattern of planned streets and a divided citadel and lower town, though on a somewhat smaller scale than Mohenjo-daro or Harappa. Within the citadel area of Kalibangan, archaeologists uncovered a row of small rectangular pits lined with fired brick, each containing ash and remnants suggestive of small fires having been lit and tended within them repeatedly over time. These structures, interpreted by many researchers as fire altars, appear alongside animal bones and other ritual debris, lending some support to the idea that fire held ceremonial significance for at least some communities within the wider Indus Valley Civilization. A gentle thread of evidence we touched upon during our earlier reflection on Indus Valley beliefs and rituals. Kalibangan's later abandonment, along with the eventual drying of the Gagarhakra River system itself, offers us an early, quiet preview of the broader environmental changes that would eventually affect the entire Indus Valley Civilization. Changes we'll explore more fully as our journey continues toward its later segments. Let's also pause briefly at Ganariwala and Rakhigarhi, two further sites worth mentioning as we consider the true scale of this civilization's reach. Rakhigarhi, located in the modern Indian state of Haryana, has, through ongoing excavation in recent decades, revealed itself to be among the very largest Indus Valley sites yet identified, in some estimates rivaling or even exceeding Mohenjo-daro in overall size. A reminder that our understanding of this civilization continues to grow and shift as new excavations carefully, patiently, continue to unfold across the region even today. Recent genetic studies conducted on skeletal remains found at Rakhigarhi have offered researchers new insights into the population history of the Indus Valley region. Though these findings remain an active and evolving area of ongoing scientific research, one we should hold, like so much else tonight, with appropriate patience and openness to future revision. What becomes clear as we consider Dholavira, Kalibangan, Rakhigarhi, and the many other sites scattered across this vast territory is just how remarkably adaptable the Indus Valley Civilization truly was. From the fertile floodplains of the Indus River itself, to the dry salt marshes of Kutch, to the now vanished banks of the Gagarhakra, communities across this enormous region maintained a broadly shared culture, shared standards of weight and measurement, shared styles of pottery and craftsmanship, a shared script, even while adapting their specific building techniques, water management strategies, and daily practices sensibly to the particular demands of their own local environment. There's something quietly admirable in this kind of flexibility, this capacity to maintain a sense of shared identity and connection across such vastly different landscapes, without requiring uniformity in every single detail of daily life. It suggests a civilization confident enough in its underlying values and systems to allow for local adaptation and variation, trusting that the deeper threads connecting these communities, trade, shared standards, cultural practice, would hold steady even as the specific expression of that culture shifted gently from one region to the next. As we consider the sheer geographic breadth of the Indus Valley Civilization tonight, from the mountains in the north to the coast in the south, from the deserts of the west to the drying rivers of the east, let yourself rest in the scale of it all, without needing to hold every detail firmly in mind. It was, in its own quiet, understated way, one of the largest and most successful civilizations of the ancient world. And yet, it achieved this success through patient adaptation and cooperation, rather than through the kind of conquest and dramatic expansion so often associated with other great civilizations throughout history. In our next segment, we'll turn gently toward the eventual decline of the Indus Valley cities, considering what the evidence suggests about how and why this remarkable civilization gradually faded over the course of centuries, without the violence or sudden collapse so often associated with the fall of ancient civilizations elsewhere in the world. Rest here a while, among the quiet stone reservoirs of Dholavira and the dry riverbed of Kalibangan, if you're ready to drift further still. As our journey moves gently toward its later chapters, let's turn now to a quieter, more contemplative part of the Indus Valley story, the gradual decline of its great cities, a process that unfolded not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly over the course of several centuries, much like the slow fading of daylight into evening. For a long time, popular understanding of the Indus Valley's decline leaned toward more dramatic explanations. Early 20th century historians sometimes suggested the civilization had been destroyed through invasion, perhaps by groups associated with the later Vedic culture of South Asia, pointing to a small number of unburied skeletons found at Mohenjo-daro as possible evidence of violent conflict. Over the decades since, however, this theory has been largely set aside by most researchers, as closer examination revealed these skeletal remains were likely unrelated to a single violent event, and were instead deposited at different times, quite possibly connected to more mundane causes, such as illness or the general use of abandoned spaces for burial after the city's decline was already well underway. There is, importantly, no significant evidence throughout the wider Indus Valley territory of large-scale warfare, invasion, or violent destruction connected to the civilization's decline. This is worth resting on gently tonight. Even in describing an ending, we can set aside the language of conflict and catastrophe because the evidence itself simply doesn't support it. Instead, the picture that has gradually emerged from decades of careful archaeological and environmental research points towards something quieter, and in many ways, sadder in its own understated way. A slow, patient unraveling brought about primarily through significant environmental and climatic change, unfolding gradually across many generations. Let's consider the rivers once more, since they were, after all, the very foundation upon which this entire civilization had been built. Beginning around 2000 to 1900 BCE, and continuing over the following centuries, significant shifts appear to have taken place in the region's river systems and monsoon patterns. The Gagarhakra River system, which had supported cities like Kalibangan, appears to have gradually dried up during this period, likely due to a combination of tectonic shifts altering the landscape and changing monsoon patterns, reducing the seasonal rainfall these rivers had long depended upon. Similarly, evidence suggests the broader monsoon system across the region weakened gradually over these centuries, reducing the reliable seasonal flooding that Indus Valley agriculture had depended upon for so many generations. Imagine, if you will, the impact of this kind of change, not as a single dramatic flood or drought, but as a slow, barely perceptible shift, unfolding across multiple human lifetimes. Perhaps the yearly floods began arriving slightly less predictably. Perhaps harvests, over the course of a generation or two, began yielding somewhat less than they once had, prompting farming communities to gradually adjust the crops they planted, moving toward more drought-resistant grains like millet. Evidence for which does appear increasingly in the archaeological record from this later period. Perhaps slowly, family by family, community by community, people began moving away from the largest cities, seeking out smaller, more sustainable settlements, closer to whatever water sources remained reliable, in a process unfolding gradually enough that it may not have felt, to those living through it, like decline at all, but simply like the ordinary, gradual adaptation of life to a slowly changing world. By around 1900 to 1700 BCE, a period researchers often refer to as the late Harappan phase, we see clear evidence of significant change across former Indus Valley territory. The great cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa show clear signs of declining population and reduced maintenance of their once impressive civic infrastructure. The careful standardization we encountered so often throughout our journey tonight, the consistent brick sizes, the shared weights and measures, the widespread use of the Indus script, gradually becomes less consistent and eventually fades from the archaeological record altogether. Long-distance trade networks connecting the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia appear to diminish considerably during this same period, echoed in a corresponding decline of Indus Valley goods appearing at Mesopotamian archaeological sites from this later era, rather than a civilization ending abruptly. What the evidence suggests, instead, is something more like a slow dispersal. Populations appear to have gradually shifted away from the largest urban centers, moving instead toward smaller settlements and toward regions further east, closer to the Ganges River system, where more reliable rainfall patterns persisted even as conditions grew increasingly difficult further west. This eastward movement, unfolding gradually over several centuries, likely contributed to later cultural developments across the wider Indian subcontinent, carrying forward certain elements of Indus Valley knowledge, craft traditions, and agricultural practice, even as the great cities themselves were slowly, gently left behind. It's worth pausing here to sit with an important, and perhaps quietly comforting, distinction. The decline of the great Indus Valley cities did not mean the disappearance of the Indus Valley people themselves, nor a complete loss of everything they had built and understood. Many aspects of daily life, farming techniques, craft traditions, certain religious or ritual practices, likely continued on in modified forms among descendant communities, carried forward into the smaller, more dispersed settlements of the following centuries, and eventually woven into the broader cultural fabric of later South Asian history. Genetic and archaeological research increasingly suggests meaningful continuity between Indus Valley populations and later inhabitants of the region, rather than a story of sudden replacement or disappearance. The cities themselves faded. The people, and much of their knowledge, quietly persisted, carried forward gently into whatever came next. There is something worth reflecting on, gently, in this particular kind of ending. So often, when we think about the fall of ancient civilizations, our minds turn toward dramatic images. Invading armies, burning cities, sudden catastrophic collapse. The story of the Indus Valley offers us something different, a civilization that appears to have met significant, gradual environmental change with patience and adaptation rather than collapse and conflict. Families and communities adjusting slowly over generations, moving where the water was more reliable, adjusting the crops they planted, gradually loosening their hold on grand cities that had, after all, been built to serve them, rather than the other way around, when those cities could no longer be reasonably sustained. It offers, too, a gentle kind of parallel we might sit with tonight, as we ourselves drift toward sleep, that endings do not always need to be sudden, dramatic, or marked by loss and conflict to be meaningful. Sometimes, things simply, quietly change, adapting gradually to new circumstances, carrying forward what matters most, letting go gently of what can no longer be sustained. The Indus Valley cities didn't fall in a single night. They eased slowly over centuries into a different form. The way an evening eases into night, the way wakefulness itself eventually eases into sleep. By around 1300 BCE, the great cities we've walked through together tonight, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Lothal, had been largely abandoned, their once bustling streets settling gradually beneath the patient accumulation of wind-blown sand and silt, their careful brickwork slowly disappearing beneath the same rivers and floodplains that had given rise to them in the first place. For well over 3,000 years, they rested quietly beneath the earth. Their stories paused, waiting. In our final segment tonight, we'll consider how these lost cities were eventually rediscovered in the modern era and reflect gently on the legacy this remarkable, understated civilization has left behind. A legacy we're still, patiently, continuing to uncover even now. Rest here a while longer among these slowly fading cities, if you're ready to let sleep carry you the rest of the way tonight. For our final segment tonight, let's gently return to the surface, so to speak, and consider how these long-buried cities came to be rediscovered in more recent times, and what quiet legacy they've left behind for us to reflect on now. For more than 3,000 years after their gradual abandonment, the cities of the Indus Valley rested largely undisturbed beneath layers of earth, silt, and time. Local communities living near sites like Harappa knew, in a general sense, that old mounds containing ancient bricks existed in their region. But the true scale, age, and significance of what lay beneath these mounds remained unknown for centuries. The first steps toward rediscovery began gradually. In the 19th century, as British surveyors and explorers, including Charles Masson, whom we mentioned briefly during our visit to Harappa, noted the presence of these mounds and their unusual, ancient-looking brickwork. For many years, however, the true importance of these sites went largely unrecognized. And as we discussed earlier, considerable damage occurred during this period, particularly through the removal of ancient bricks for use in railway construction. A quiet, practical decision at the time that unknowingly diminished part of the archaeological record for future generations. It wasn't until the early 20th century that serious, systematic archaeological investigation began. Indian archaeologists Daya Ram Sani and Rakhaldas Bandyopadhyay, working under the direction of the Archaeological Survey of India, conducted key excavations at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, respectively, during the 1920s, gradually revealing the true scale and sophistication of what lay beneath these ancient mounds. Sir John Marshall, then head of the Archaeological Survey of India, played a significant role in coordinating and publicizing this early research. And it was through this combined effort that the wider world first began to understand that an entire, previously unknown civilization, every bit as significant as those of ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, had once flourished quietly along the Indus River thousands of years earlier. The discovery was met, at the time, with considerable scholarly excitement, as it pushed back the known history of urban civilization in South Asia by well over 1,000 years, revealing a level of sophistication, particularly in city planning and water management, that surprised many researchers accustomed to viewing early urban development primarily through the lens of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Since these initial excavations, archaeological work has continued gradually and steadily across the region for the past century, through periods of political change, including the partition of British India in 1947, which placed many key Indus Valley sites, including Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, within the newly formed nation of Pakistan, while sites like Lothal, Dholavira, Kalibangan, and Rediscovery remained within India. Researchers and institutions in both countries, along with international collaborators, have continued this patient work of excavation and study in the decades since, each new find adding another small, careful piece to our gradually deepening understanding of this civilization. As we reflect tonight on everything we've encountered along this journey, from the quiet floodplain villages of Mayagar, through the wide, orderly streets of Mohenjo-daro, the granaries of Harappa, the tidal docks of Lothal, the intimate details of everyday homes and family life, the small carved seals and their patient, unsolved script, the gentle uncertainties surrounding belief and ritual, the adaptive resilience shown at Dholavira and Kalibangan, and finally, the slow, peaceful fading of these great cities. It's worth considering, gently, what legacy this civilization has ultimately left behind. Perhaps its most enduring legacy lies precisely in what made it so distinctive among ancient civilizations. Its demonstration that large-scale, sophisticated urban society doesn't require grand monuments to individual rulers, doesn't require extensive written propaganda glorifying military conquest, doesn't require dramatic displays of centralized power in order to thrive. Instead, the Indus Valley Civilization shows us a different model entirely, one built around shared standards, cooperative trade, careful civic planning, and what appears to have been a genuine, sustained concern for public health and everyday well-being, reflected so clearly in their remarkable attention to water management and sanitation. Achievements that, in some respects, wouldn't be matched again in many parts of the world for well over 2,000 years. There's a quiet lesson here too, in how this civilization ultimately came to an end, not through the dramatic collapse so often associated with fallen empires, but through patient adaptation to a slowly changing environment, communities gradually adjusting, moving, and carrying their knowledge forward into new circumstances, rather than clinging rigidly to cities that could no longer sustain them. It's a gentle reminder that resilience doesn't always look like resistance or struggle. Sometimes, resilience looks like graceful, unhurried adaptation, letting go gently of what no longer serves us, while carrying forward what truly matters. The influence of the Indus Valley Civilization likely continued on, in subtle, quiet ways, within the broader cultural development of the Indian subcontinent in the centuries and millennia that followed. Certain craft traditions, particular approaches to agriculture, perhaps even elements of belief and ritual practice we touched on gently earlier, may well have been carried forward by descendant communities into later South Asian civilizations, though tracing these specific threads of continuity across such a vast expanse of time remains a careful, ongoing area of archaeological and historical research. One that continues to develop and refine itself even as we rest here together tonight. As our journey draws to its gentle close, let's take a moment to simply sit with the wide, unhurried scope of everything we've walked through together. A river valley, patiently shaping fertile land across thousands of years. Villages slowly growing into some of the ancient world's largest and most sophisticated cities. Streets laid out with quiet precision. Homes built with genuine care for privacy, comfort, and cleanliness. Children playing with small clay toys in courtyards warmed by an ancient sun. Traders carrying beautiful carnelian beads across vast distances of both land and sea. Small seals, carved with patient hands, holding a script that still, even now, keeps its secrets closely and gently to itself. And finally, a slow, graceful fading as communities adapted patiently to a changing world, carrying their knowledge forward into whatever came next, leaving behind quiet cities that would rest undisturbed for over 3,000 years, waiting patiently to be found again. If you're still with us at this point in our journey, thank you for spending this time here, walking slowly through these forgotten streets and quiet courtyards, resting alongside people who lived, worked, and rested here so very long ago. And if you've already drifted off somewhere earlier in tonight's journey, that's exactly as it should be. This story, like the rivers that shaped it, will still be here, patient and unhurried, whenever you'd like to return to it. If tonight's journey through the Indus Valley brought you some measure of calm, you're warmly welcome to subscribe, so that future journeys through other quiet corners of history will be waiting for you. Whenever you next need a gentle place to rest your mind at the end of a long day. For now, let your breathing continue its own slow, steady rhythm. Let your thoughts settle gently, the way silt settles slowly along a riverbed, layer by patient layer, undisturbed. There is nothing more to do tonight, and nowhere else you need to be. Sleep well,